Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 21. In this episode, we're talking to James Knapton, currently working with Adrian Newey from the Aston Martin Valkyrie. James has a long history of working in Formula One. We'll discuss how you can start to apply some of those tools and techniques, processes, and the way in which they go racing in Formula One to your own racing. If you've ever wondered how that can help your own track experience, then this is a great episode for you. So as ever, get comfortable, grab a pen, get a coffee, sit back, and enjoy what James has to say. So welcome, James.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's lovely to have you on the show. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. I think people listening will get so much from the world of engineering and the way in which professionals go about motorsports that hopefully we can get one or two takeaways and bring that back down and be able to apply that in a club level. I think sometimes the professionals have got a lot more resources, a lot more people. So just having a thought about how we go about racing would be absolutely fascinating for people to hear about. But before, so who are you? Tell us a bit of background of what you're doing. I think people will be really interested to hear your story, and then let's get into it.
Okay. So James Knapton. How old am I now? 44 years old. Yeah. You get to an age where you have to think about it. I did a degree in mechanical engineering at Newcastle University. I am from that part of the world. I then did 2 years at Jaguar Cars before they merged and were called Jaguar Land Rover, but really wanted to get into motor racing and be a race car designer.
Is that something you've done? Have you had experience? Have you driven? Have you had some exposure to motorsport?
Yeah,
what made you want to get into it?
I got into racing watching Formula One in about 1984 on the TV, and then went to some of the Grand Prix in the UK, sort of 85. I went to Mansell's first win. I was there in 87 when Mansell won at Silverstone. He overtook Piquet. I was there at that corner. And then I was there again in 92 when he had that great win and the crowd went mad. So I've been lucky to go and see some great Nigel Mansell wins, although I'm not much of a Nigel Mansell fan.
Just to flag, like all the Formula One drivers, past and present, just so I wouldn't want them turning off at this point.
So actually, no, that's unfair. I think I've come to appreciate him a lot more over the years. At the time, I wasn't a fan. I was anyway. It's not a big deal. I watched Formula One. Really wanted to be a Formula One driver. Did karting. Realised I wasn't even that good at my own club level. So pretty much figured if I wasn't stellar at my own club, I wasn't going to be a Formula One driver. So I enjoyed that, but did it for a few years, but pretty much parked the idea of being a professional racing driver. But partly because also at the time it felt like if you weren't a Formula One driver, there wasn't a career as a racing driver. The idea that actually there are so many more levels of racing probably didn't register. But I was quite academic, quite technical, and I liked the idea of being a race car designer at the time when I think in the late 80s, the designers would draw the car during the week and go and race engineer it at the weekends. And that looked a very interesting thing to do. Times have changed quite a lot. Ended up doing mechanical engineering, couldn't get a job in racing. Cosworth turned me down, all sorts of places turned me down. So went to work for Jaguar for a couple of years. Got a job in the end, applied for a job as a designer at Jordan Grand Prix down at Silverstone. Didn't get that. And then a few weeks later, they rang me up and said, we've got a job in the aero department as a designer. Are you interested? Come for an interview. Largely got the job because they needed someone who was willing to play on the left wing of the wind tunnel football team against the factory every week. I knew how to use the card system, but they wanted a left winger and they were sick of getting beaten by the main factory because the wind tunnel was in Brackley. I come across John Eiley, who would run in the department at the time. A brilliant guy, actually. And so I ended up working for him and at Jordan. And at a time when Jordan were doing quite well, they were sort of I joined in 2000 and the cars were quite quick. So I learned a lot there, did that for 4 years or so, but wanted to get closer to the real cars because we were down at the wind tunnel in Brackley. So I moved up to vehicle dynamics, working for a guy called James Key, who is now technical director at McLaren, and stayed there and eventually ended up running the department a few years later. That was good fun. While Jordan morphed into Midland, Spiker, Force India, ran that department for 2 or 3 years.
Just picking up on that, because some people who are listening may be looking to get into motorsport as a professional. The focus really is the club driver, but a lot of people who listen are also looking to start or pursue their careers already. How did you navigate the uncertainty of that period? Because effectively you stay probably in the same desk on the same computer and the banner above the door changed, but the uncertainty every week of what's going on. How did you feel about that?
It actually, you get used to it. I think it probably went from 2004 or 5 when Jordan was starting to struggle a bit and financially struggling through probably until I left in 2013. You were never totally sure. You just get used to it. The brain is very good at whatever situation you're in, be it very bad or very good, developing that feeling like normal. So you get used to the fact it was uncertain. And yes, you thought you could lose your job, but you parked that in the back of your mind and just got on with it. And Jordan was a really efficiently run team. Actually, you never really felt like you were going to go to the wall because they weren't really spending very much money. So it was always an attractive team. Even when it was Midland, Spiker, Force India, we managed to do things on an absolute shoestring budget. So a lot of parallels with club racing, probably.
I was going to say.
I grew up doing karting on schools, literally on £5-10 a week, pocket money, occasionally being able to afford a new set of tyres once a year. So I'm familiar with what that side of motor racing is like. And then, had a brief stint at Sauber in Switzerland, came back to Force India, worked in the aero department again, doing some tool development for their trackside, sort of what they call aero performance group. Did a couple of years of that, went to work at Manor F1 when they reborn out of Marussia. That was an awful lot of fun. Sadly, they went bust at the end of the year. And then had the option to go to Williams, but then also an option to move out of F1 and go and work for Adrian Newey at Red Bull Advanced Technologies, doing a pretty interesting car, the Aston Martin Valkyrie, which for me was fantastic because it was active suspension and all these sort of brilliant things you couldn't do in Formula One. And been there ever since. We've done an aborted Le Mans car, an aborted track car version. I'm now working on quite an interesting electric car that I can't say too much about, but it's pretty high performance. And the Valkyries we're continuing to develop. That's pretty much my career over the last 20 years.
That's absolutely fascinating. What's it like working with Adrian then? Come on.
What's it like? It's challenging because he's on top of it all the time. He wanders over and he doesn't say, hello, how was your weekend? It's, hello, I've been thinking about this brake system. Why don't we do it like this? Have you thought about that? Can you look at that? Can you test it? So you've got to be properly on your game all the time with him. And he really understands every part of the car. He's designed whole cars, so he knows what a car can do. Doesn't really take any nonsense. You can't bluff him. So you've got to be on top of your game. But he's good to work with. You learn so much from him. He's always pushing. He pushes the designs to the limit. So you really learn how to develop a car as good as it can really be. Absolutely fascinating working for him. Not always easy. He will push you to the point that is really hard. It can be hard work for it. But you learn so much and grow so much working for him. Yeah. So amazing experience. I'm so glad I did it, really.
Yeah, because obviously it's a step out from motorsport. So that's quite a big, though it's sort of on the fringes and still with the same kind of people.
Yeah, it's interesting because we work at Red Bull. We're in the same office now as the F1 people. We have a lot of colleagues that we know through using the tools and having to work with them, but also ex-colleagues who I've worked with in Formula One in the past. So it's quite a small industry. You come across a lot of people, and we're similarly developing a high-performance car. The Valkyrie is very extreme. And some of the other cars we've done, we were looking to do. The Le Mans car was a proper race car. We were developing a track day version of the Valkyrie, which we were predicting to be about as fast as the 919 Evo car. And that was the sort of performance target we were looking at, not just a normal track day car, but something pretty special. Yeah, we don't tend to just go for simple projects. We like to push the limits. And yeah, it's good because Formula One, you're operating right on the top of the curve and trying to eke out tiny little performance gains. Whereas the projects we do, we can go into the simulator and find 2 seconds a lap with some changes, which is quite rewarding. Whereas the guys in Formula One will be really happy if they find a 1/10 of a second in a session. So it's different types of rewards, really. But yeah, they each have their sort of enjoyments and frustrations, really.
Yeah, so talking about racing, and setting up your car. I think you have some thoughts on this. So if I was I'm a club racer, I've got a car, it's got some level of adjustment on it, more than your standard road car. What would you suggest that I should start with?
I would start with the things that are easy to change. And often, this is the thing that often you imagine there's going to be some magic bullet in professional sport, and actually the reality is it's just doing the basics. And
sorry, just jump in the olden days of maybe a Formula One and high level motorsport, you'd go to the track and then you'd spend your practice time tweaking.
Yeah.
Now, from what I can see, as an outsider looking in, the things like the suspension settings, which is the kind of the bigger things that maybe more the club racer has access to change, don't look from the outside as if they're tweaked. You haven't got people adjusting clicks on dampers and things like this. So there must have been some preparation. They must be pretty confident in whatever they take into the track, they're not going to change. At the same time, for us going racing, how can we what can we do, I suppose, to help ourselves to make
I think, look, Formula One teams have massive resources in terms of pre-event preparation, in terms of simulation, simulators, 7-post rigs, lots of simulation tools. So they will go into an event more or less knowing how to set the basic mechanical setup, the springs, the dampers. And some of that will be from what they did in the simulator. Some of that will be based on what they did last year. Some of that will be based on what they've seen in the last few races as the car this year with the current tyres move towards a bit more oversteer. So we'll take last year's setup and we'll add a bit of understeer into it, something like that. But in terms of club racing, yes, it is very different because you don't have access to all the pre-event preparation. I think you go into the event and think, what can I change? If it's, let's say, if you can change the anti-roll bars or adjust the anti-roll bars, there's something to try. If it's a weight distribution change and you don't have any ballast that you can easily move around the car, that's not such an easy thing to do. And one of the big problems with going to an event is, you don't usually have very much time. Track time is quite limited, like any series now. And you don't want to be doing changes that take 2 or 3 hours. So if you are going to make a change, you want something that's quite quick. It's A, because you don't want to lose track time, and B, you want to make change and feel the difference quickly. If you make a change and you've left it over lunch or it's the next day, the track might have changed, the weather tech has changed, and we all know these things have an impact on how the cars feel. So it depends what you are able to change fairly easily and get a feel for quickly, because one of the best changes we ever did in Formula One was we had a roll damper on the car that just operates when the car is rolling, but it was an adjustable damper and it was located under a hatch. So they could come in and, with the engine still running, pull the hatch off, little Allen key in there, change the damper settings. 10 seconds later, the car's gone back out. They haven't even stopped the engine. The driver can perceive the difference. He hasn't even got out of the car. And that's a really nice test, because actually it's not a very big performance item, but in terms of being able to do a really clean back-to-back, because the track environment is a really awful environment for doing testing. And testing is the way you have to do experiments. If there's one thing that in the sort of notes I wrote down going into this, what I wrote down so many times is the only real way to progress is to test, is to do a test, do an experiment, try something. Don't just believe the simulation tools. Don't just believe the old wives' tales from somebody will tell you, you go to Thruxton, you run this damp. Test it, go and try it. Now, that's not always easy in club racing because you don't always have adjustable dampers. Bits can often take time to change and you don't have a lot of track time. But where you can, just do experiments. We don't, in Formula One, we rarely will do an absolute thing and say that's the setup for that track. It will be, I'll take the baseline setup that I know sort of works and I'll try an experiment of a stiffer anti-roll bar or more wing or a lower ride height, and I'll see if that's better. And we try and make little changes, and all the time we're trying to just migrate the car slowly over time. We're not trying to make big changes every weekend. And in fact, that's something that I've noticed in my time in Formula One was this. We used to go from having quite different setups every weekend at different tracks to realizing actually the best way was to have the same setup on the car more or less every weekend, and gradually
the world is rejoicing at this moment.
You know what you've got. You know what you've got, and actually once you've optimized it, the optimal setup for each track is not very different. Perhaps maybe it's a bit different in club racing, I'm not sure, but certainly in Formula One, the tracks are not too different. Even the fast tracks between teams used to go to Monaco and run really soft cars, and then they started thinking we'll do an experiment. We'll run a stiff car that's good for aerodynamics versus a soft car, and it was always the stiff car that won. And you'd never think that at Monaco. You'd be softening the car off and things like that. And no, it's aerodynamics wins in Formula One, so you set the car up for the aerodynamics and generally don't change the car very much year on year. I'll probably get shot for telling you this, but one of the guys who actually was from the Red Bull Formula One group who was leaving recently, and he came to work in our department because often they get put in, if they go into a competitor and they don't want them carrying on working in the Formula One team for a few months, they'll send them to us as gardening leave. And he was telling me that Red Bull won 4 world championships, didn't change the dampers once. Whereas now they're not winning championships every weekend, the dampers are changing a little bit because you're worried that's the thing that's not making you win. And that's a perfect example in Formula One. Dampers, once you're in the ballpark, don't give you an awful lot of performance. And if you're happy and you've got a winning car, like most people in racing, what do? You won't change it for the next race. And therefore, Red Bull winning from 2010 to 2013, when they were winning all the time, they didn't feel the need to mess around with dampers every week because the car was quick.
On that point, one of the times that people do start making those kind of adjustments is in the wet. So is there anything that you'd recommend that people would do in the wet? Because in my experience, people try and soften the car, in inverted commas, in the wet using the dampers. So they'll wind it. If they do have adjustable dampers, they'll sort of wind down the dampers. And often people would if they have an anti-roll bar, they may disconnect it or disconnect one end of it. They're just trying to soften the car. They do pump the tyres up, because that seems to give more grip. But it's all very much based on experience and wisdom. What's your thoughts? What would you start? If it was going to be raining, what would you change on the car, if any?
Yeah, it's a great question because actually in Formula One, usually we don't change the car very much. Partly because usually we're focused on setting the car up for the race, and we have this thing we call parc fermé, where the cars, from the minute they go out in qualifying, you can't really change them apart from the flap angle, the front wing flap angle. So you can't, if you think it's going to rain, yes, you might go a little bit more of a wet setup. But actually for us, wet setups don't really differ that much. We'll reduce the front wing flap a little bit, probably won't change the dampers very much. The tyres are slightly larger, the wet tyres, so they'll pull the car into a slightly higher ride height position. Yes, we might run slightly higher pressures, I agree with that. And because weather forecasting is not that accurate that you can really predict what the weather is going to do at 1 o'clock tomorrow, you tend to play it a bit safe and not really go too much for a wet setup. That said, if it was club racing and you could change the setup and do whatever you like, I think, yes, those sort of things that you just said soften the car, because actually in the dry, when you've got more cornering performance, camber thrust out of your tyres is quite important, and you really don't want the car to roll. So that's why you would that's one argument for setting a car up stiff, is to stop it rolling, which is good for the camber thrust on the tyre. If your tyre's cambered into the corner, it generates a lot more grip.
So just to pick up on that, Brian, so you've got your tyres sort of tilting in, and you don't want it to... No, you do. You'd want it tilting in. Ideally, you'd have all your tyres tilting into the centre of the corner. There's a lot of grip in that. People often think you want the tyre contact patch as flat as possible. In racing, you probably want quite a bit of camber on the tyres if you can. That gives you quite a bit of grip. Now, again, it might differ. It differs between a racing slick and a big Formula One tyre versus a road car tyre. So it comes down to do an experiment. I can't emphasise this enough, is what works for somebody, one person, might not work for you, and it might not work for your car. People drive in different ways and have different approaches to the corner and require different setups. So you need to find out what works for you and experiment with the car setup. So yes, you might say, actually, I'm going to try a soft setup. I'm going to try softer dampers. But if you get a chance on a wet test day, go and try each of those things, because you might be surprised that some of them might feel quite different, but make no difference to lap time. And others might generate quite a bit of performance, and others might give you more stability, more confidence in the car, to which you feel you can then push the car harder. Performance. I was doing some work in the simulator, and I was driving the car yesterday,
and the car felt like it had too much understeer. So I was trying a setup that got rid of that apex understeer. And I thought, well, if I get rid of that, I'll generate a lot of performance in the car. I was convinced I was going to find quite a bit of time in the. But I did that, and all it did was the setup changes I made, the anti-roll bars, it just made the entry nervous, and it didn't give me the confidence to really stand on the brakes and throw the car into the corner. And actually, it ended up not really being quicker. Yes, I had less understeer, and I could see that in the data, but it just didn't give me the confidence to really stamp on the brakes and throw the car into the corner. So actually, it was no quicker. There's probably some lack of talent on my part, but equally, there was an experiment I did that didn't turn out as I expected it to. So I can't emphasize that enough. Is all those things you say make perfect sense, but I would try and find a wet test day and go and try them all one by one, because you would never stop learning. I was messaging the guy who's, I think, the vehicle performance director at Mercedes, Loic, Sarah, the other day, and we were talking about a mutual friend, and he made the comment that you're always learning, and he's always learning stuff every week. And this is the guy, in charge of performance at Mercedes F1, and they just look phenomenal. They are phenomenal. And he's still humble enough to say, and he's a super smart guy, but he just says, yeah, I still learn all the time.
So is there a particular process that you follow that enables you to have more certainty in that learning? Because one of the things that I see, because I'm an engineer like yourself, and so some of this stuff you sort of take for granted, but if you haven't had exposure to a science experiment, for want of a better description, how would you go about that? And is there anything that you'd recommend people were aware of or thought through if they decided to give that a go? Because you said process like 3 or 4 times now. It's the right answer, but we need to put that into some kind of like...
The big thing, yes, there's no magic. It's about thinking, and it's like anything. It's have a go at it, and you'll get it, sort of make some mistakes, have another go at it, and then have another go at it. And by the time you've done something 3 or 4 times, you start getting all right at it. So if you're going to do a damper test, try and think, okay, if you've got an adjustable damper, let's say, or some adjustable damper, think, what is the tester I want to do? You don't have to plan it in minute detail, but say, look, I'll start on the baseline, which is the dampers I normally run. Okay, so I'll do a run of that. I'll do 4 or 5 laps on that, and I'll just so I get in, and if I get a bit of traffic or I make a mistake, I'm not going to ruin the test. So I'll come in and I'll change to my new damper setting. I'll go and change the damper setting. I'll go out and do another 4 or 5 laps, and I'll see how that feels. I'll look at the lap times. I'll look at the data, but actually, firstly off, I'll say, what does it feel like, and is it quicker? Because ultimately, they're the 2 big things. Keep it simple, and then I'll go and do the baseline again, because actually, the track might be changing, the weather conditions might be changing, and the time you've done this might be over an hour or 2. The whole things can change. You get better. One of the great things I learned when I was running simulators in Formula One was you would get a driver in for a whole day simulator running, and we would every 4 or 5 runs we would baseline him with the same setup that we start the day on. And it was brilliant because you could track a driver across a day, and even the very best F1 drivers would get in it in the morning and take 5 or 6 runs to settle down. And then they would start to get a bit tired and from being sat in the simulator all morning and trail off a bit. But then you'd tell them it was lunchtime after the next run, and they suddenly perk up and do a really fast lap time. Then you get in after lunch, and they'd be having had a nice lunch in an F1 canteen. They'd be quite slow and ready for an afternoon nap. Then they'd settle down pretty quickly after a run or 2, but then start to tail off over the afternoon more because it's getting towards the end of the day and they're tired. And then you tell them it's the last run of the day, and they go and set the fastest lap of the day. So even at F1 driver level, you're seeing this variation of performance across a day that comes and goes as they get used to the setup of the car, they're getting used to the simulator, they're getting used to, if it's at the track, you're getting used to the track. It's probably not quite like this at track events because you're not driving for 8, 9.
I can give you some information about that. Right? So I did some work with a driver recently who I'm doing a bit of coaching with, and we ran a heart rate monitor on him for the day. And he went out, and you could see he had quite a low level in the morning, and then he went out and did his first session, and it's peaked up, and it was like quite high. And for people who think motor racing is all just sitting, for the 10 or 15 minutes that he was driving around. But what was really interesting was that the session finishes, so he did 4 sessions in the day, and so you had this profile. But what was really interesting, I found, was the middle bit, so the bit when he wasn't driving. And interestingly, his heart rate did not come right back down to where it had started in the morning. In actual fact, it grew during the day. So he was actually still quite wound up. There's still adrenaline going on, and that's quite exhausting throughout the day. And so basically, by the time you get to the end of the day, it's quite tired, really. And he hadn't really done anything. He was only sat in the car and driven around,
Yeah. Oh, totally. But motorsport is, even though it's sat in the car, it's physically, you've got a lot of G-force on you, so it's physically tiring, but it's mentally really tiring. And we talked about this, didn't we, the other day, that actually it's one thing that's really hard to do is drive and engineer yourself on the same day, because actually the driving is mentally tiring. And pretty much, if you do, that's enough, really.
That's the nice thing about what you're saying about having the process. And I just think that it's the ABA process, as you're talking about. Yeah. So you start off with one setting, that's A, then you try something which is B, and then you go back to A. It's the back to A bit that will be news to people, I think.
Yeah, and we learned this over a number of years in F1, that actually, really, you need to do A, B, A, B, A is a decent test. Okay. Because actually, yes, you might have done A, B, A, but the placebo effect is a really big thing in motor racing. You can tell a driver, this is the new damper, this is going to be better, and they will drive faster even if you've changed nothing. Because I feel it myself in the simulator. The number of times I've heard the guys have been working with me going, oh, we've put a new code change in, and I go, yeah, I felt that. And they say, oh, sorry, we made a mistake, we didn't put that in. They're not trying to catch me out, they just didn't get it right. But you've convinced yourself it does feel different. So yeah, often at the track you don't really have time to do ABA, but we'll certainly do that in simulators, and that's a really pure way of saying, because that way we're not missing usually any track evolution, any tyre degradation, any weather changes if the wind changes, that sort of thing. So that's, again, it's nothing, there's no magic in it. You're just doing the basics really well, which is, because these are quite small time deltas you're looking for. So you say, okay, let's say my lap-to-lap consistency is half a second, but I'm looking for a damper change that might only be a tenth of a second difference. So how do we find that? What you can do is you can do 10 laps and then average the lap time across the 10, and then you can start to see the very small deltas. If you take an average over 10 laps, or you take an average in the low-speed sections or the high-speed sections. So that's the sort of thing we now have to try and do in Formula One when we're looking for very small gains, is average multiple laps and take a corner on multiple laps and say, is there a gain through there?
Yeah, I think I suppose one of the nice things at a more amateur level is that the gains can be a little bigger, and therefore maybe easier to spot. And I think you made several points there about the confidence, and you talked about the simulators. So how do professional teams or use simulators? Is it the same as my PlayStation? What is the difference, and what is it that you're doing in that we could maybe try and replicate in something as simple as a PlayStation?
I fundamentally don't think that different. The big difference is we populate the models with better quality data that should be closer to the real car. So we will get tyre data from the tyre supplier, engine data from the engine manufacturer, aerodynamics data from your aero group. You get mass and inertia data from your design group, and spring and damper data that you've actually measured on the dyno. In theory, the car should be much closer to the real car. It's not always the case, and you then have to do a correlation exercise. So having driven the real car, you'll then have a race driver come in and do a correlation check in the simulator to say, on the same track, does it feel the same? And usually at that point, you are tuning the tyre grip level. So we will have grip scalers. So we might scale the tyres up to 105% of what the manufacturer has told us the grip is, or 95%. And we will just tweak the tyres a bit and maybe tweak the downforce a little bit until we're matching as closely as we can to the real car, if you like. And then once you're at that point, then you can start doing some setup changes that are much the same as you would do at the track. But I think, it's about, if you're going to use a simulator at home, I think probably the best thing is for them is driver coaching as much as anything. And seeing, I've played iRacing and I reckon it's pretty good. And they use LiDAR scan tracks, I believe, which are the same as quality as tracks as we use in Formula One. And that's a big deal because that picks up the bumps and the subtle nuances of tracks that you don't just get if somebody's just modelled a circuit. And that's a big thing, where a road dips away or a bump as you come into braking. You know all about this. It can change how you drive a corner and things. I think iRacing is fantastic. It gives you a chance to try setups and practice things and see what might work and what might not. I don't quite know what tyre modelling is exceptionally hard to do well, even in Formula One. I know 2 of the top 3 teams struggle with it more than you might expect. And yeah, I know the World Championship winning team, Mercedes, struggle with it sometimes because they lost the race at Silverstone because they were struggling with tyre temperature. And yet, they're a fantastic organisation. I think all 3 teams do. I don't know much about what goes on at Ferrari. It's an incredibly hard thing to get tyre modelling right because you're dealing with molecular interactions between the rubber and the road. It's not just simple rubber sliding over tarmac. It is incredibly difficult to model what is happening in the contact patch. Yeah, so you're trying your best to get the tyre modelling right in the simulators, and that's often where the amount of effort that teams like Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari will invest in tyre modelling is just incredible. And therefore, I think that's often maybe where the home sims are not quite as accurate, but I think iRacing do a pretty good job.
I think the objective is slightly different. So if you're using a simulator as an engineering tool, then the tyre model, it's all about the tyre model. Go with me on this one. There's counter arguments to everything I'm saying. But if you're using it a toy, which is like whatever, but also if you're using it as like you say, a coaching or a driver training environment, for me, that's where the simulators that we can get, consumer level ones, are brilliant. Because again, if we go back to the mental thing that we talked about a minute ago, you can sit around and you can do basically for free as many laps as you want on that simulator. And if you can still, perform and you're still concentrating, you can bring that to your real racing. And in actual fact, because the simulator it's lacking in terms of the engineering quality of the model, but it's also you're lacking in terms of sensations as well. When you actually go and drive a real car, I personally find it easier to drive a real car than the simulator. So you're like almost, it's a training tool. It's like being in the gym for your mind.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think as a training tool, and bear in mind, Formula One teams, the drivers will come in often before a race to get themselves up to speed with the circuit. So they are doing effectively training sessions and driver. It's not just about setup on the car. The drivers to come in and have a preparation session so that when they hit the track on the Friday, and they really know where to brake, how fast to go, and therefore they don't spend 20 minutes dialing themselves into the circuit. They are ready to go straight away. And that's a big thing.
I've just had an idea as we've been talking about this. It's like, I suppose there's no reason, because we're talking about when you go to the track and you want to make a change, to try and do it in a procedural way. I suppose there's no reason why, because we can change all these different things on even the most basic PlayStation games, iRacing, whatever. You can change settings on the car. You can change springs, dampers and things. You can make adjustments. So I suppose there's no reason why you couldn't run through a similar kind of program, or the idea of that program ahead of time. It's not going to be the same, right? It's not going to be the same outcome, but the idea of running through the program of going, right, I'm going to drive around, do 4 or 5 laps, make a change, drive around, get some feedback. And that's a question I've got for you in a minute. Like, what makes good feedback from a driver? But hold that thought.
Yeah.
Then you go off and you put all the settings back to how you started, have another go and see where you're at. And then just getting into the habit of doing that, so that when you do go to the track, it's, I know what I'm doing now, for real.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, it's practice things over and over again, and they become second nature to you. You're absolutely right. Practice the procedure of having a bit of a run plan so you know what you're going to do next. You do the setting, and how do you double check you've got the setting and not made a mistake, and then go and do the run. Practice writing down your comments somewhere, or how do you create a score out of how you're going to score that run? Because by the time you've done 3 or 4 runs and baselines and repeats, you've forgotten what you did on run 2.
What's great driver feedback then? What from a driver? Because again, just to frame this, there's 2 things. So if you think back to the driver and the engineer all the same person, so I think one of the things to be aware of is just trying to separate that. But I'd be really interested in your thoughts of like, what is good driver feedback from your perspective?
You want to know, is the car better or worse, and where is it better or worse? You don't necessarily need to know why. You want the driver to point at which corners or which phases of the corner are better, and try and understand. That allows you to, as the engineer, to go and look at the data and say, why was it better, or try and understand why was it better.
So is that something you do? You break the corner down into different phases?
Yes, so we will usually break it down into straight line braking, entry, apex, part throttle, exit when you're getting on throttle, and then straight line exit conditions. So some people do into more sections. I think you can overthink it a bit too much. But in Formula One, a driver will have a map, and every single corner he'll come in at the end of the session and go, right, turn one, entry was okay or no.
So you're sitting with a driver and a track map, and you're sort of marking that up.
Yes. So you can either do it corner by corner in each phase, or you can say, often you will just say, what about what's low speed entry, what's low speed apex like, what's low speed exit, what's high speed entry, high speed. Because often it's the same, unless the wind's blowing different directions in different parts of the circuit. The car will have a handling characteristic in low speed corners and high speed corners. So we may break it down like that instead of going through every single corner on the lap. But yeah, in terms of feedback, you're just looking for consistent feedback from the driver. You don't want it too detailed. I've worked with drivers who'll come in and say, oh yes, on the third lap it did this on turn 3 and that was score of 3.27, and then on the next lap it was a score of 3.48, and it just gets a bit too much. You want the driver to come in and say, okay, we made that change. It understeered a bit more in the low speed corners, and that was good. Made the car a bit more stable, but it also lost me some time at the apex. But then I could get on throttle a bit earlier, and then you'll start looking into the data and say, is it faster overall, or is it, are we gaining time, losing time?
Is there a particular way you get the driver to drive to do these kind of things, or you just sort of say, drive naturally and tell us what's happening? Drive around problems.
They can, and there have been drivers I've worked with in Formula One where you've got a problem with the car and it's very hard to dial the problem out because they just drive around it. That's the challenge. It's very strange. I found no correlation between how good a driver is as a race driver and how good he is as a test driver. Usually they're diametrically opposed. The really good race drivers actually don't make great test drivers. They often don't know why something feels quick or slow. Whereas actually I think that the really good test drivers, they think about it a lot, and that possibly holds them back from. I think the really quick racing drivers they don't think about it too much. They just go and drive. Whereas the really good test drivers are thinking about it all the time. Oh, did I go fast enough through there? Was it on the right line? And that requires a lot of mental energy, really. But they can give you very good feedback at the end of the run.
That's a really interesting point, actually, and something that we talked about a little bit, or alluded to, about the engineering and the driving together. And so, like, in one sense, that comment undermines everything, because if you're doing it for yourself, you're saying don't bother doing anything scientifically because you'll think about it too much. But equally, in the back of your mind, you have to think, it's like, if I don't do this right, then I'm going to be slower. So, and actually, all it takes is one other person to do it. Get the basics is what you're talking about.
Yeah,
they're going to be up the road, and you're going to be like driving better than them, but they're going to win, and you're not going to know why.
Yeah. It is really hard, and especially if you're doing it yourself. I think thinking about the engineering and thinking about the driving is really challenging, really hard. I think sometimes if I'm in the simulator on myself trying to do that, I almost try to forget about the driving and just drive relaxed, and I'll make a change and just go and drive some laps, not really look at the time, and then come back to it and go, right, because you can. Again, it's this placebo effect. You think you're making a change that's better, you will naturally drive a bit faster and a bit harder. So the lap time is there, but I think sometimes it's better just to relax and just drive consistently at probably 98% of your ultimate pace. And if the performance is there in the car, it will come. If you genuinely have made the car better, it will naturally come. And that's probably what makes a good test driver. Because I can sometimes sit there, I'll do 5 laps of Silverstone and make a setup change and do 5 laps of Silverstone. And I don't really know. Then I'll look afterwards and say, oh, look, there was half a second in that setup there. Didn't really feel like it at the time, and I wasn't watching the stopwatch. I'll go back and look into that. Why? Where was that performance in that setup? Was it just one lap happened to drive a couple of corners better, or is there something in there that I can see makes a difference to the setup of the car? Have I changed the roll balance of the car and it's giving me better traction performance out of low speed corners? Low speed corners is where all the performance is. High speed corners, yes, you've got to be ballsy to drive them flat out, but it's all about low speed corners is where the performance is.
So why is that? Why are low speed corners where?
It's a non-linear effect. Maths, I'll try and write it down for you and send it to you, because it's a really interesting bit of maths that is basically, because it's a 1/over factor of the speed you're doing, that grows quite exponentially down to low speed. So if you're going through something like Lowe's hairpin at 30 miles an hour or something like that, if you go a couple of miles an hour faster and you look at the amount of time you're gaining per meter, it's not very much. It's like, a hundredth of a second per meter. But you go and then look, say, through the tunnel at Monaco, you're doing 300 kph, you go and look at how much faster you have to go to get that same amount of time gained per meter. It's 200 kilometers an hour faster. It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's this non-linear effect. It's really, when you see it, you can break it down into some really simple maths. If you just look at the time gained per meter at, say, if you start off really simple at 10 meters a second, because it's easy to do the maths, which is 36 kph, which is about the speed of Lowe's hairpin. And you look and say, if I go 11 meters a second through that corner, I gain, 1 over 10 is the amount of time to go 1 meter in the first case, and 1/11 is the amount of time to do that meter in the second case. And then go and apply that to the fast corner, like the tunnel at Monaco at 300 kph. And it's a staggering amount of performance you've got to find. It's all about low speed corners. And a couple of instances recently I heard Damon Hill talking about it, and Christian was talking about Max versus Alex and some of the challenges Alex has been having driving the car. And you're saying it's all delta between the two is all in the low speed corners. Damon Hill was talking, watching an old interview by Damon Hill, I think was it for Motorsport magazine or something like that, and he was saying the differences of the Sennas and the Schumachers when he was racing them, the delta was all in the low speed corners. It's where all the performance is. And if you can focus on that, because often people focus on trying to be fast in the high speed corners, because they're often harder to drive than the low speed corners. But if you can just carry a bit more speed through a low speed corner, there's huge amounts of time in it.
So how would you approach a corner? What's the most important part of the corner? If you're looking at those different phases, is there a most important part?
Yeah, I think it's the entry phase to the corner. Okay. Yeah, and it's the hardest point. That's where you can gain a lot of time if you're better. That's where the really good drivers differentiate themselves from the average ones, because it's really hard. You're trying to brake and turn the car in, and the back end wants to come round on you, and the car feels unstable. So you can overcome that by driving slower, but being able to drive as fast as you can when the car feels really unstable is very hard. And it's something you can't back out of easily enough. So apex speed, if you go a bit fast through the apex, you just come off the throttle and the car will continue to rotate. If you're coming out the corner, you press the throttle. And if you press it too much, if it's front wheel drive, you'll just understeer a bit. If you rear wheel drive, it'll oversteer a bit. You can just come off the throttle. If you've overcommitted on entry to a corner, you're in a bit of a world of pain there, because there's not a lot you can really do. You can't press the brakes to slow yourself down more, because you'll just lose your lateral grip and the car will spin more. You can't steer out the corner because you're going to miss the corner. Really, that's really often the only thing you can do. You sometimes see Formula One drivers do that now. If they overcommit to a corner, they'll just abort the corner and go down the slip road, because they know they're not going to make it round the corner. And that's often the difference between you'll see an amateur spin it by trying to carry too much speed into the corner. The really top drivers know just how much speed to carry into the corner. And corners are really interesting because each phase sets up the next one. So if you have problems on entry, you can mitigate that by, V'ing the corner, but then that just gives you a really tight apex. So it feels like the car understeers at the apex, but it's because you've made the entry easier for yourself. So the sequence of entry, apex, exit just follows itself, and the problems you build up through the corner start from the entry phase, really. So definitely entry is the most important.
Yeah, so interestingly, I suppose it a little bit depends on your experience and your level. So my opinion on this one is that a lot of drivers who are not at a professional level worry too much about the corner entry and struggle and outbrake themselves and get themselves into trouble. And consequently, all the rest of the phases are always a compromise. The advice that is quite often given, and I quite like to give it, if that's the situation, is like almost forget about the entry a little bit to get the middle and the exit as good as you can do it, because you're going to be accelerating all the way down the next straight. And so compromise on that tenth or two on the way in to make sure that you get the exit.
And actually you make a really good point. As I think about it, actually, in terms of lap time, your exit performance is really important. So because you will carry anything gained down the straights. What I tend to think about it as an engineer is when I'm dealing with quite high-level drivers is if there's a problem with the car on entry, it will lead to problems at the apex, lead to problems at the exit. And you're absolutely right what you're saying about don't overthink it, just back off a little bit, get the entry sorted so that you can get a good exit. It's about getting a good exit because that will gain you a lot of time. But actually at our level, in really top-class professional level, that's an easy part to get right, the exit. The apex is the really professional drivers are the ones who can carry a lot of speed into the entry and still get a good exit. But actually, yes, I totally agree with the entry is the hard phase, and you can easily overcook it by trying to be, the last of the late breakers and giving yourselves an easier time on entry. You certainly set the car up. And again, it comes down to you're making your entry better and cleaner and easier, and therefore you've set yourselves up for the apex and the exit. And yes, the performance will definitely follow from that. I
think that's one of the things that you see that so novice drivers or people who are maybe plateaued at a certain level, mid-grid, for example, just see so they're frustrated. It's like, how do I go quicker? These other guys are quicker than me. I should be doing, and they're frustrated. And so the temptation for some people is to effectively overdrive, which is effectively what we're talking about, and just to be a little bit too aggressive in these corner entry phases. That means that they might hook it up 1 out of 10 times, but on a rate, which is fine for qualifying, but in a race situation, on average, they're going to be slower because they're taking too aggressive in that area. But it does take a lot of confidence to calm down a bit, really. I think it's a fascinating one. It's a fascinating one.
No, it is. And I always think it's fascinating. Motor racing is unlike a lot of sports where, most of us can't hit a ball as fast as a top tennis player or run as fast but we can all press a throttle pedal as hard. And actually the skill of a racing driver is the restraint they show.
Yeah.
Because anyone can barrel into a corner too fast. And actually, when you look at amateur versus professional racing drivers, a professional often doesn't have the highest apex speed, but he's gained on entry and he gains a lot on apex because he can get on the throttle earlier. And you're absolutely, yes, it's a very difficult thing, racing, because it's got a macho culture. Everyone worries if they're mid-grid rather than I go and play tennis at a weekend and I don't mind if I lose. But if ever I'm karting or racing or something like that, you feel properly, your pride feels hurt, don't you? I think you've just got to practice at it and try, and it's like anything.
We talked a little bit before about coaching. So what's your experience of that? Because at an amateur level, there are several coaches around, but there's a definition of coaches that is quite interesting. And so what is a coach? But what's your experience? I mean, do the Formula One guys have coaches and we just don't know about them, or how are they going?
I don't really have a lot of experience of it. Most F1 drivers, as far as I know, don't have much coaching. We went through a phase at Force India of sending the drivers sometimes. Who's the guy up at Bruntingthorpe who used to coach Raikkonen a bit? That's him. Yeah. So I think
Rob was on the show recently.
We used to send. I didn't get very involved in it. It was Race Eng looked after it, and our head of race engineering knew Rob Wilson quite well. And we used to send the drivers there.
Interestingly, but this is quite fascinating because you're talking about Rob as a coach, and he is a coach, but he's quite technique orientated. So he's trying to help your technique and refine your abilities.
Yeah,
coaching involves quite a lot more. I think there's a lot of performance planning. I think my experience in Olympic sports is that we talk about a performance plan. So you have the technical bit, that's one part, but you've also got the tactical, the physiological, the mental side of it. There's quite a few elements that go into performance, and the technical bit is one, and that would be an instructor. That's what but a coach would maybe umbrella over all of those and support you in a much broader.
Yes, I don't think we had. I don't remember coming across coaches in that respect. So we would have a lot of the drivers would have fitness coaches and guys who were looking after their diet. There was an area that they were quite strong on. Most of them are quite strong in that area. There will be some, occasionally go and do a bit of technical coaching with somebody like Rob Wilson. But as a holistic coach, they will talk. The drivers will have their race engineers to talk things through with.
That's a really important point. That the race engineer, I personally think, is very similar to a coaching role.
Yeah.
So they have an overlap. It's just the race engineer in motorsports has got more of a technical background, and maybe the coach in a sport has got more of a, less of a technical background,
yes.
more of a human-focused background. Yeah. But I think they do very much the same job, to be honest.
Yeah, quite great. And it's interesting now at Red Bull, so classically in race engineering, you would have what was called the race engineer, who was the person in charge of the setup and the operating the car. And then you'd have his junior guy, his data engineer, who was working his way through and hoping he was going to be the race engineer in a couple of years. It's interesting now at Red Bull, what we have is 2 race engineers per car, one called race engineer performance and one called race engineer, and I think we call it management or operations. So the guy you hear on the radio, be it Giampiero for Max and Simon for Alex, they are classed as race engineer. I think it's management they call them. I can't remember the exact title, but they are they've recognized that these roles are not as technical as they used to be. They leave that to someone else. It's about managing the driver performance and managing the team and mechanics. It's about delivering the whole performance for the whole car. So about getting that group of people, the driver, the 2 race engineers and all the other engineers in the back and the mechanics all working together as a cohesive unit. So yes, you're absolutely right. That's become more of a coaching role. And the classic race engineer type role that was doing the car setup is now done by another race engineer who is purely looking at performance of the car, looking at the data, deciding on the setup. So I think Red Bull are quite good in recognizing that those different disciplines, that sort of personal discipline and that technical discipline. It was interesting. I was just going to say it was interesting because I always wanted to be a race engineer, but because I always liked the look of the people management and the getting the most out of the group of people and operating. What I didn't really have the aptitude for was staring at data all day, and I didn't really ever fancy being a data engineer. So I never got the opportunity because I didn't want to go through the years of being a data engineer. You have to do anyway to really understand the car. But actually that looked a thoroughly miserable job to get to the really enjoyable job, from my perspective anyway. So that was what stopped me going trackside most of the time.
I've got a data question for you. So what do you look, because you mentioned data a few times, what do you look for in the data, and what kind of tips and tricks would you suggest for people if they've got their own data? It's not going to be quite at the same level, but they'll have some level of information. So what kind of things would you...
I think, what do we use data for? So we use data to tell us, is the car doing what it should? If we've made a change, can we see that change has happened? It has some impact on the car. If we've changed an anti-roll bar or something, and we're trying to see if there's more or less understeer in the car, can we see that in the data? That's the sort of thing I tend to use it for a lot, and then try and use it to identify, again, rather than looking at an absolute lap, I'll be looking at a comparison between a baseline and the new setup, and where are the differences and where is it gaining or losing? Because real data is horrible stuff. It's really noisy and it's inconsistent, and it's really hard to make judgments from. And often you can be looking at data going, well, is that better or worse? And it's very hard to know. And so it becomes a skill looking at it and going, yes, okay, I made that change to try and reduce the understeer in the car. Can I see that? Oh, yes, I can, because I'm seeing I'm steering less. The steer angle is less through the corners, but I'm not faster. Okay, where is it? Because I'm slower in other parts of the corners, or is it just because even though I've reduced the understeer, I'm not going any faster through the corner? Quite basic stuff, really, is what we will use that for. And we can get a bit more sophisticated than that, but actually most of the time it's quite simple stuff.
Is it really focused around balance, or are you looking at performance as well?
No, we tend not. It tends to be around balance a lot of the time. But for instance, a vehicle I'm working on at the minute, we're doing a lot of, it's got control systems on it, like traction control and ABS. So we're doing a lot of work and saying, we tried a new idea on the traction control. Did it make the car accelerate out the corner better? So that's purely a performance thing rather than a balance thing. It depends what you're looking at. Not so much in sort of Formula level and the cars, we don't look at driver, but certainly Red Bull has like its junior driver program, and the drivers will come in and do sim sessions. And what's interesting is in other formulas where you've got the same car, Formula 3 or GP3 or whatever it's called these days, they've often got quite a historical database of car data they can compare to and say that maybe you should be driving a bit quicker through there, or have you thought about braking? Of course, you see, the problem is with something like a Formula One car, the car is changing all the time. And virtually by the time a Formula One car finishes a season, it's quite a different car to how it started with so many updates. And so if the driver's struggling with it, it's often quite hard to determine, is it the car or is it the driver? We've got this year the Red Bull Formula One car. Alex is a step of time away from Max Verstappen that the team really doesn't expect. And we don't think it's just Alex. We know the team knows there's problems with the car, not handling as well as it should. Max can drive around those problems. Alex is struggling with some of the handling issues of the car. So it's not just, the race engineer doesn't just sit there on Saturday night and go, Alex, you need to drive faster. They're well aware that the car is not behaving as well as it should, and therefore they need to work on the car as much as the driver.
It's fascinating. Oh, so look, I just wanted to say thank you for your time. Have you got one final thought that you could leave us with?
What's the final thought? What did I put down as? I tend to forget things quite easily, so I thought I'll write down some notes at least. I think just test things. Don't just believe the old fables about this setup works at Thruxton on a wet Easter Monday. Go and try it for yourself if you've got time. You don't always have time, but often the idea is, often there's good merit behind the old wives' tale. You need to go and prove it and understand it for yourself. So go and test it and see if it works for you. It might not work for you. It might work. It might not work for your car. It might not work for you as a driver. Go and try stuff. Don't be afraid to experiment. You will learn so much by trying stuff. Pick a philosophy and stick to it, or that's more a car development approach. But if you think a stiff car is going to work for you, develop it and work on it, and it will work for you. In Formula One, you've got Red Bull and Mercedes with very different philosophies on car design, but they're both at the front of the grid. A lot of the rest of the grid tries to copy them, but it's not about the philosophy they picked. It's about how they keep pushing through that philosophy. Try and improve 100 things by 1%. I think Dave Brailsford coined it really well with its marginal gains. In the past, when I've been quite good at something, did photography for a while and ended up getting quite good at it, and I stopped to think, what is it about my photography that makes me quite good, or what am I doing I wasn't doing when I started out? And I analysed that and said, actually, it's not really, I'm not doing any one thing particularly that much better, but I'm doing lots of things. I'm focusing, I'm choosing the right exposure, I'm choosing and we're doing everything just a little bit better. And that adds up to a big end result better. And I think that's I think
you talked about it earlier. You said about doing the basics better.
Yeah.
I think quite often it's hard to know what the basics are, to be honest with you. So the process is one, the looking at the corner and prioritizing elements of the corner is another when you're doing your driving. Trying to manage yourself through the day in terms of being aware you're going to get fatigued and tired. There's so many little gems that we've talked about in the show that are basically all we're talking about is these are the basics, but they are basics because through trial and error, that's what worked. The process is made you're just trying to make life as easy as possible to go racing.
Yeah, that's it. You do it because it's got to be fun at the end of the day, hasn't it? There's no point going to do it if you're not enjoying it. So go and enjoy it first of all. But then if you want to get better, just try stuff, practice. It sounds simple, and actually, but implementing the simple stuff often is harder than you think.
That was the idea of maybe practicing on the simulator, because that'll be quite weird to do that. I'm probably going to get 100 people writing and say, "Oh yeah, I want to do that." It's like, okay, it's just from my experience, I've never done it, but I was like, actually, rather than just pounding around trying to learn the track that I'm going to, maybe I'll practice some setup evolution on the track as well, and just say, I don't know what changing the springs are going to do, but I'm just going to change them because it's not going to cost me anything other than my time. I can just change the number in the box, drive around. What does that feel like? And then put it back and then see what even if I haven't got any data, I can still feel the difference and look at the lap time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's so much it'll get you a long way just doing that. But exactly, practicing beforehand will get you into a really good routine when you go to the track. Because you've got so much to think about at the track, haven't you, when you go there and scrutineering and when's the session on, and so much to think about. It's so hard just to focus on driving. I always think it's really easy for Formula One drivers. They've just got a little timetable, turn up here and drive the car. That's a world away from club racing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a little bit. But at the same time, they have different challenges. You know?
They have very different challenges. Yes, they do. And they have lots of challenges and pressure. When you're going club racing and you've got to try and remember to fuel the car, what tyres have I got on? Have I pumped the pressures up? Have I done a setup? Has it gone through scrutineering? When's my practice session start? You've got so much mentally going on in your head. And that's probably the other takeaway from Formula One is by having a plan beforehand, it makes your life so much easier of what you're going to do. If you've got a bit of a run plan or something. In Formula One, it is so hard if something goes wrong in a race and you haven't thought about what you're actually going to do at that point. So they have lots of plans of, we practice this. And
there's a friend of mine, funny story. I thought it was funny. He worked in Formula One. He was quite senior, and he said we used to practice when the car broke down. And it was just like, why would you do that? Surely you want to be practicing tyre changing. He said, no, we want to practice when the car breaks down. And so the car's broken down mid-race. What are we going to do? Right, we're going to move all the chairs. This is the procedure for getting a car into the garage in a neat and orderly fashion.
Absolutely. Otherwise, it's chaos. Otherwise, it's utter chaos. That's the difference. Often that you just practice things going wrong. It's like professional pilots. So they get to the top of the descent. They're about to come into descent, and they don't talk so much about what they're going to do on the landing. They talk about what they're going to do if this goes wrong and that goes wrong. We can't land on that runway. And so they are prepared and they know what they're going to do when it goes wrong. Because your brain completely closes in when things go wrong and stress stops you from thinking. And it's just an incredibly hard thing to do. But
Well, honestly, really, thank you so much. It's been fascinating talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you.
Really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you very much.
What an absolute privilege to have James on the show. He's got such a wealth of experience in racing. I hope you got some great takeaways there. I certainly did. And I hope you can go and apply those next time you're on track. You may know that at the end of season 1, I wrote the Motorsports Playbook, a summary distilling the first 20 shows into nuggets of wisdom. I made the notes so that you don't have to. If you've not got it yet, go and grab yourself a copy from the website. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.